The gunshot still echoed in the valley as Victoria Porter clutched her crying infant to her chest, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. She had nothing left, no food, no money, and no husband to speak of. The harsh Dakota Territory wilderness of 1879 showed no mercy to a widow with a 3-month-old baby. As little Emma's cries grew more desperate, Victoria felt her heart breaking. It had been nearly 2 days since either of them had eaten properly. Victoria had buried Frank just yesterday after outlaws had ambushed their wagon on the trail to Deadwood. They'd taken everything of value, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back, her wedding ring, and her starving child. She'd managed to walk 5 miles toward what she hoped was civilization before collapsing under a cottonwood tree, her strength finally giving out. "Hush now, Emma," she whispered, bouncing the infant gently though her arms ached with fatigue. "Mama will find something for you soon." But the words felt hollow. Her own stomach twisted with hunger and her milk had all but dried up. The sound of hoofbeats made Victoria freeze. Instinctively, she pulled Emma closer, ready to run if necessary, though she knew in her weakened state she wouldn't get far. A rider appeared through the trees, tall and imposing on a magnificent chestnut stallion. Victoria's heart raced as the stranger approached, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Madam," the man's voice was deep but gentle. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. "Are you all right?" Victoria couldn't bring herself to answer as the man stepped closer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that contrasted with his weathered face. When Emma let out another piercing cry, the stranger's expression changed to one of concern. "Your baby." He began moving closer. Victoria tensed, ready to protect her child with her last breath. The man seemed to sense her fear and stopped, raising his hands slightly. "I mean no harm, madam. Name's Mason O'Brien. I've got a small ranch about 3 miles east of here." Emma's cries grew more insistent, and Victoria felt tears of shame and desperation well in her eyes. "She's hungry," she admitted. "We both are. My husband was killed by bandits yesterday and they took everything." Mason O'Brien's face hardened at this news, but his voice remained gentle. "Your baby's hungry." He knelt down to Victoria's level, his eyes full of determination. "Not while I'm here." Without another word, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. "It's not much, just some jerky and cornbread, but it'll help until we get you somewhere proper." Victoria's pride warred with her desperate need to feed her child. Emma's cries decided for her. With trembling hands, she accepted the food. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. "I don't know how I'll repay you." Mason shook his head firmly. "No need for that, madam. What's your name?" "Victoria Porter." She moistened a small piece of cornbread with water from the canteen Mason offered and carefully fed it to Emma, who quieted immediately. "Mrs. Porter, I can't leave you and your little one out here. My ranch isn't fancy, but I've got a spare room, food, and a warm hearth. You're welcome to stay until you get back on your feet." Victoria looked up at this stranger, this cowboy who'd appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. In the harsh world of the frontier, such kindness was rare. "Why would you help us?" she asked. Mason's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners as he looked at the now quieter baby. "My ma always said true measure of a man is what he does when no one's watching." He paused, his gaze drifting to the distant horizon. "And I reckon there's enough suffering in this world without adding to it." He offered his hand to help her up. "Can you ride? We can make it to the ranch before sunset if we leave now." Victoria hesitated only for a moment before taking his hand. Whatever dangers might lie ahead at this stranger's ranch couldn't be worse than certain death in the wilderness. "Yes," she said, finding strength in her voice that surprised her. "We can ride." Mason helped Victoria onto his horse, making sure she and Emma were secure before taking the reins and leading them eastward toward his ranch. As they walked, Victoria felt something she hadn't expected to feel again so soon after burying Frank Hope. The journey to Mason's ranch took nearly 2 hours, with the cowboy leading his horse on foot the entire way, refusing Victoria's offers to walk. Emma had fallen asleep against her mother's chest, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the small amount of food in her belly. As they crested a small rise, Mason pointed ahead. There it is. Not much, but it's home. Victoria followed his gaze to see a modest but well-maintained ranch in the valley below. A small main house constructed of logs with a stone chimney stood proudly beside a sturdy barn. A corral held several horses, and beyond that, a small herd of cattle grazed in the distance. It wasn't grand by any means, but to Victoria's weary eyes, it looked like paradise. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. Mason glanced back at her with surprise before a small smile crossed his features. "Most folks wouldn't call it that, but I'm obliged for the compliment." As they approached the ranch, a dog came bounding out to greet them, a large, friendly-looking animal with a mismatched coat of brown and white. It barked once in greeting before circling Mason excitedly. "That's Patch," Mason explained. "Don't worry, he loves children, had him since he was a pup." An older man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He raised an eyebrow at the sight of Mason leading his horse with a woman and baby on its back. "Samuel," Mason called out. "We've got guests." The older man approached, his curious expression giving way to concern as he took in Victoria's disheveled appearance and the sleeping infant. "Samuel Dawkins, my ranch hand and the best cook this side of the Mississippi," Mason introduced. "Samuel, this is Mrs. Victoria Porter and her daughter." "Emma," Victoria supplied. "Mrs. Porter's husband was killed by bandits yesterday," Mason explained quietly. "They're going to be staying with us for a while." If Samuel was surprised by this announcement, he didn't show it. He simply nodded and said, "I'll get a room ready and put on some stew. The poor lady looks half-starved." Mason helped Victoria down from the horse. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her as she touched the ground, and Mason steadied her with a strong hand on her elbow. "Careful now," he murmured. "You've been through a lot." Victoria nodded gratefully, adjusting Emma in her arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake. "Let's get you both inside," Mason said, leading the way to the house. The interior of the ranch house was simple but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with worn but clean furniture arranged around it. A wooden table with 4 chairs sat near a small kitchen area, and Victoria could see 2 doorways leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. "It's not fancy," Mason said, almost apologetically. "It's perfect," Victoria replied honestly. After spending the previous night huddled against a tree, the modest ranch house seemed like a palace. Samuel bustled about, stoking the fire and putting a pot of stew on to heat. "The room at the end will be yours, Mrs. Porter," he said. "It gets the morning sun, which will be nice for the little one." Victoria found herself overwhelmed by the kindness of these 2 men. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You've saved our lives." Mason shook his head. Any decent man would have done the same. But Victoria knew that wasn't true. The frontier was full of stories of people who'd been left to fend for themselves, who died alone because no one stopped to help. What Mason had done wasn't common, it was extraordinary. Within an hour, Victoria found herself seated at the table with a bowl of hearty stew before her. Emma was awake now, and taking milk from a bottle Samuel had somehow procured. The older man had explained that one of their neighbors had a new baby and had sent over some goat's milk. "Eat slowly," Mason advised as Victoria began to devour the stew. "Your stomach won't be used to much food right now." She nodded, forcing herself to take smaller bites despite her hunger. As she ate, Mason sat across from her, his own bowl untouched as he watched her with concern. "Tomorrow we can ride into town and see about getting some supplies for you and Emma," he said. "And I'm sorry about your husband. If you'd like, we can send word to the marshal about the bandits." Victoria paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Thank you. His name was Frank. We were headed to Deadwood. He had a job waiting at a mine there." She swallowed hard. "I buried him near where it happened, but it wasn't a proper burial." Mason's expression darkened. "We can go back, give him a proper marker if you'd like." The simple offer brought fresh tears to Victoria's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Do you have family somewhere?" Mason asked gently. "Someone we could contact?" Victoria shook her head. "My parents died 2 years ago. Frank was all I had, and now." She looked down at Emma, who was contentedly drinking from the bottle Samuel held. "Now it's just us." "Not anymore," Mason said firmly. "You've got us now for as long as you need." Victoria met his gaze, surprised by the determination she saw there. This man, this stranger who owed her nothing, had decided to take responsibility for her and her daughter's welfare. In that moment, she felt something shift inside her, a small ember of something beyond gratitude beginning to glow. "Thank you," she whispered, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt. Mason simply nodded, finally turning his attention to his own meal. As they ate in companionable silence, Victoria found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with laugh lines around his eyes suggesting he smiled often, though he seemed serious now. His hands were calloused from hard work, but they had been gentle when helping her from the horse. For the first time since Frank's death, Victoria felt safe. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. She was a widow with an infant in a harsh land, but somehow, sitting at Mason O'Brien's table, the future didn't seem quite so bleak. That night, lying in a real bed with Emma sleeping peacefully beside her, Victoria allowed herself to truly grieve for the first time. She cried for Frank, for the future they'd planned together, for the fact that Emma would never know her father. But beneath the grief was a surprising undercurrent of hope that perhaps she and Emma might find a new beginning here, in this unexpected place of refuge. Dawn broke clear and bright over the O'Brien ranch. Victoria woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a working ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, men's voices calling to one another. For a moment she was disoriented, then the events of the previous day came rushing back. Frank was gone. She was at a stranger's ranch. Emma was. Victoria sat up with a jolt, looking frantically beside her, but Emma was gone from the bed. Panic seized her as she scrambled to her feet, still wearing the clothes she'd arrived in. She rushed from the bedroom, her heart pounding. The scene that greeted her in the main room stopped her in her tracks. Mason O'Brien sat in a rocking chair by the fireplace, holding Emma carefully in his large hands. The baby was awake and calm, staring up at the cowboy with curious eyes as he spoke to her in a soft voice. "And that's why horses need special shoes," he was saying seriously to the infant. "Their feet aren't like ours, you see." The sight of this tall, strong man cradling her tiny daughter so tenderly made Victoria's breath catch. Mason looked up, noticing her presence, and a slight flush colored his cheeks. "Hope you don't mind," he said, starting to rise. "Samuel heard her fussing and we didn't want to wake you. You needed the rest." Victoria shook her head, moving forward to take Emma. "Not at all. Thank you for looking after her." Mason carefully transferred the baby to her mother's arms. "She's a good little one. Hardly made a peep once Samuel fed her." As if on cue, the older man emerged from the kitchen area with a cup of coffee. "Morning, Mrs. Porter. Sleep well." "Better than I have in days," Victoria admitted. "And please call me Victoria." Samuel handed her the coffee. "Breakfast will be ready soon. We've got some clothes for you too. They belonged to Mason's sister when she visited last year. Might be a bit big, but they're clean." Victoria was overwhelmed once again by their thoughtfulness. "You've both been so kind. I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks," Mason said, rising from the chair. "I need to check on the herd, but I'll be back by midday." "Thought we might ride into town then, get those supplies for you and Emma." Victoria nodded, grateful for the plan. As Mason moved toward the door, donning his hat, she called after him. "Mason," he turned, his hand on the doorknob. "Be careful out there," she said softly. A smile touched his lips, transforming his serious face. "Always am, madam." After he left, Victoria sat at the table with Emma in her arms, sipping her coffee. Samuel bustled about, preparing a breakfast of eggs and bacon. "He's a good man," Samuel said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Best I've ever known." Victoria looked up at the old ranch hand. "How long have you worked for him?" Samuel chuckled. "Other way around, actually. This was my place originally." Mason came through about 5 years ago, just a young buck of 23 with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back. I was getting too old to manage alone, so I offered him work. He flipped the bacon in the pan before continuing. Within a year, he'd turned this struggling ranch into something profitable, bought in new breeding stock, expanded the herd, had a knack for it. Samuel's voice grew softer. "When my arthritis got bad 2 years ago, I was fixing to sell up. Mason wouldn't hear of it." Insisted on buying in as a partner instead. Now he runs things and I just help out where I can. Victoria absorbed this information, finding herself increasingly intrigued by Mason O'Brien. He seems special, Samuel nodded. That he is. Lost his folks young, raised by his grandfather until the old man passed when Mason was 16. Been making his own way ever since. The old man glanced at Victoria. Don't think I've seen him take to anyone as quick as he took to you and your little one, though. Victoria felt her cheeks warm. He's just being kind. Samuel gave her a knowing look, but said nothing more as he served up breakfast. After eating, Victoria found the clothes Samuel had mentioned laid out on her bed, a simple blue cotton dress, slightly faded but clean and well-made, along with undergarments and a shawl. There was even a small basin of warm water for washing. By the time she'd cleaned up and changed, feeding Emma again with the goat's milk Samuel provided, midday was approaching. She heard hoofbeats outside and moved to the window to see Mason returning, his figure straight and tall in the saddle. Victoria couldn't deny the small flutter in her stomach at the sight of him. She immediately felt guilty Frank had been dead less than 3 days. What kind of woman was she to feel anything for another man so soon? She pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to gratitude and nothing more. Mason entered, bringing the scent of sunshine and open plains with him. He smiled when he saw Victoria in the blue dress. "Looks nice on you," he said simply before turning to Samuel. "Everything quiet here," the older man nodded. "Not a peep of trouble." "Victoria and I have been getting acquainted." Mason looked pleased. "Good. Ready to head into town?" he asked Victoria. She nodded, gathering Emma, who was wrapped in a soft blanket Samuel had found. The old ranch hand waved away Victoria's thanks as Mason helped her up onto his horse, before mounting behind her. The ride to town was unlike anything Victoria had experienced before. Seated in front of Mason, his arms around her to hold the reins, she was acutely aware of his presence, his solid chest at her back, the clean scent of him, the careful way he held the reins to avoid jostling Emma. "The town's small," Mason explained as they rode, "but it's got what we need. General store, doctor, church. The people are decent enough." Victoria nodded, her mind filled with practical concerns. "I need to find work," she said suddenly. "I can't impose on your hospitality forever." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Let's get you settled first," he finally said. "There's no rush." "But Victoria," he interrupted gently, "you've just lost your husband and nearly starved. Give yourself time to heal." She fell silent, knowing he was right but uncomfortable with accepting charity for too long. Her thoughts were interrupted as they crested a hill, and the town came into view, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rest. As they rode in, Victoria was aware of the curious glances thrown their way. A woman with a baby, riding with Mason O'Brien, was clearly a source of interest. Mason stopped in front of the general store and dismounted, then carefully helped Victoria down. As her feet touched the ground, a plump, middle-aged woman emerged from the store, her eyes widening at the sight of them. "Mason O'Brien, as I live and breathe, twice in 1 week. This must be a record," she exclaimed before her gaze settled on Victoria and Emma. "And who might this be?" Mason placed a protective hand on Victoria's lower back. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is Victoria Porter and her daughter, Emma. They're staying at the ranch for a while. Victoria, this is Harriet Jenkins. She and her husband run the general store." Mrs. Jenkins's expression softened as she took in Victoria's pale face. "Pleasure to meet you, dear. Come in, come in. We've just got a shipment of baby things in from back east." The store was well stocked for a frontier establishment. As Mrs. Jenkins cooed over Emma, Mason quietly explained Victoria's situation in hushed tones. The storekeeper's face grew serious, then determined. "You poor dear," she said to Victoria. "Well, you're in good hands with Mason. Now let's get you what you need." For the next hour, Mrs. Jenkins helped Victoria select necessities for herself and Emma: diapers, baby clothes, a few simple dresses for Victoria, toiletries. Mason insisted on adding extras: a pretty hair ribbon, a small silver rattle for Emma, a jar of hard candies. When they reached the counter, Victoria was dismayed by the size of the bill. "Mason, it's too much," he silenced her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Let me do this," he said quietly. "Please?" Something in his eyes made further protest impossible. Victoria nodded, blinking back tears. As Mason paid, Mrs. Jenkins leaned in to whisper to Victoria. "He's a good man, that one. Never seen him like this with anyone before." Victoria didn't know how to respond, so she simply smiled and thanked the woman for her help. Outside, they encountered more townspeople, all curious about Mason's companions. He introduced Victoria simply as a friend who was staying at the ranch, offering no further explanation. Victoria was grateful for his discretion. Their last stop was at the doctor's office, where Mason insisted Emma be checked over. The doctor, a kindly older man named Dr. Wilson, pronounced the baby healthy despite her recent ordeal. "You're both lucky," he told Victoria. "Another day or two out there." He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. As they prepared to leave town, packages secured behind the saddle, Mason paused. "There's one more place we should visit," he said quietly. "The church, I thought maybe, for Frank." Victoria's throat tightened with emotion. She nodded, unable to speak. The small white church stood at the end of the main street. Inside, they found the pastor, a young man named Reverend Thomas. When Mason explained the situation, the Reverend immediately agreed to say prayers for Frank and offered to ride out to place a proper marker on the grave. "Thank you," Victoria managed, her voice thick with tears. "He was a good man. He deserved better than what happened to him." The Reverend placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "The Lord sees all, Mrs. Porter. Your husband is at peace now." As they left the church, Victoria felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Frank would have a proper marker, proper prayers. It was something, at least. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both Victoria and Mason lost in their own thoughts. Emma slept peacefully, lulled by the steady motion of the horse. As the ranch came into view, Victoria broke the silence. "I don't know how to thank you for today," she said, "for everything." Mason's voice was soft behind her. "Seeing you and Emma safe is thanks enough." That evening, after a hearty dinner prepared by Samuel, Victoria sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emma sleeping in her arms. The vastness of the Dakota sky took her breath away, endless swaths of orange and pink fading to deep purple. She heard the door open behind her and knew, without turning, that it was Mason. He settled into the chair beside her, offering a cup of coffee, which she accepted with a smile. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the horizon. "I've never seen anything like it," Victoria admitted. "Where Frank and I lived in Pennsylvania, the trees always blocked the view." Mason sipped his coffee. "That's why I love it out here. You can see forever." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the soft chirping of crickets. "Mason," Victoria finally said, "I need to ask you something." He turned to look at her, his expression open. "Anything? Why did you really help us? The truth." Mason was quiet for so long that Victoria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and contemplative. "When I was 12, my mother died. Pneumonia, my father, he couldn't cope, started drinking. We were living in a small town in Colorado then." He paused, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "One winter night, he went out and never came home. They found him frozen in a snowdrift 3 days later." Victoria's heart ached for the boy he had been. "I'm so sorry," Mason nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "My grandfather took me in. He was a good man, tough but fair. Taught me that a man's duty is to help those who can't help themselves." His eyes shifted to Emma's sleeping form. "When I saw you two out there, I remembered what it was like to be alone and afraid. No one should have to face that, especially not a baby." The simple honesty of his answer brought tears to Victoria's eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. His skin was warm and rough beneath her fingers. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. Mason looked down at their hands, then slowly turned his palm up to clasp hers. The gesture was gentle, asking nothing, yet Victoria felt it throughout her entire body. "You're not alone anymore, Victoria," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither of you are." As the last light faded from the sky, they sat hand in hand, watching the first stars appear. Victoria knew she should pull away. It was too soon, too complicated, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. For just this moment, she allowed herself to feel something beyond grief and fear. Something that felt strangely like coming home. The days at the O'Brien Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Victoria helped with cooking and household tasks, insisting on contributing in whatever way she could. Emma thrived under the care and attention of not just her mother, but Mason and Samuel as well. The baby's chubby cheeks filled out, and her smiles came more frequently, especially when Mason was near. 2 weeks after their arrival, Victoria was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard riders approaching. 3 men on horseback came into view, and she recognized one as the town marshal from their visit to town. Anxiety twisted in her stomach as she hurried inside to find Mason. He was already moving toward the door, having heard the horses. "Stay inside with Emma," he said quietly, his expression serious. Victoria nodded, gathering Emma from her basket near the fireplace. Through the window, she watched as Mason greeted the men, his stance relaxed but alert. Samuel appeared at her side. "That's Marshal Davis with Deputy Williams," he explained. "Don't know the third fella." Victoria strained to hear the conversation but could only catch snippets. The men seemed to be describing something to Mason, who listened intently, before nodding and pointing in the direction Victoria had come from when Mason found her. After what seemed like an eternity, the men tipped their hats to Mason and rode off. He stood watching them go for a long moment before returning to the house. "What was that about?" Victoria asked as soon as he entered. Mason's face was grim. "They caught the bandits who killed Frank," Victoria gasped, clutching Emma tighter. "They did." Mason nodded, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "A gang of 3. They've been terrorizing travelers between here and Deadwood for months. Marshal Davis said they caught them trying to sell your wedding rings in Custer City." Victoria's hand flew to her throat, where Frank's wedding band hung on a leather cord alongside her own ring, the only possessions the bandits hadn't taken. "My rings are still here. They had others," Mason explained grimly. "You weren't their first victims." Victoria sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "What happens now? There'll be a trial in Deadwood next month. They'll hang, most likely." Mason's voice was matter of fact. "The marshal wants you to testify if you're willing." Victoria nodded slowly. "I want to, for Frank." For the others, they hurt. She looked up at Mason, a question in her eyes. "Will you come with me? You couldn't keep me away," he answered without hesitation. That night, Victoria dreamed of Frank for the first time since his death. In the dream, he was smiling, telling her it was all right to be happy again. She woke with tears on her cheeks but a strange sense of peace in her heart. The next morning, she found Mason in the barn, brushing down his horse. For a moment, she simply watched him work, admiring the sure, gentle movements of his hands. When he sensed her presence and turned, the smile that lit his face made her heart skip. "Victoria," he greeted her. "Everything all right? Where's Emma?" with Samuel. "He's teaching her about sourdough bread." Victoria smiled at the absurdity of it. Emma was far too young to understand, but Samuel talked to her as if she were taking notes. Mason chuckled. "He'll make a baker of her yet." Victoria stepped further into the barn, breathing in the comforting sense of hay and horses. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for sending the marshal after those men." Mason shook his head. "I didn't do much, just described them and told the marshal where to look." "Still," Victoria insisted, moving closer. "It means a lot to know they won't hurt anyone else." Mason set down the brush and turned to face her fully. "Are you all right about the trial, I mean?" Victoria considered the question. "I think so. It feels like closure somehow." She paused, gathering her courage. "Last night I dreamed about Frank." Mason's expression softened. "Do you want to talk about it?" No one had asked her that before, if she wanted to talk about Frank, about her loss. The simple question opened something inside her, and suddenly she was speaking, the words tumbling out. "We met when I was 16. He worked for my father's furniture business. He was kind and steady, and I thought he hung the moon." She smiled at the memory. "We married when I turned 18, against my parents' wishes. They thought we were too young." Mason leaned against the stall door, listening intently. "We were happy, though. When my parents died of influenza 2 years ago, Frank decided we should go west, start fresh. He'd heard about the mining opportunities in Deadwood." Victoria's voice caught. He was so excited about giving Emma a better life. He sounds like a good man, Mason said quietly. Victoria nodded. He was. In my dream last night, he told me it was all right to be happy again. She looked up at Mason, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Do you think that's true, or am I just trying to ease my own guilt? Mason considered her question carefully. I think, he said slowly, that a man who loved you enough to want to give you a better life wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your days in mourning. Being happy doesn't dishonor his memory, Victoria. It honors what he wanted for you. His words touched something deep inside her. Victoria stepped forward and, before she could overthink it, wrapped her arms around Mason's waist, pressing her face against his chest. After a moment of surprise, his arms came around her, holding her gently. Thank you, she whispered against the rough fabric of his shirt. Mason's hand came up to stroke her hair, the gesture so tender it made her throat tight with emotion. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Victoria Porter, he murmured. She pulled back slightly to look up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were, of the warmth of his body against hers. Something changed in Mason's eyes as he looked down at her, a flicker of heat that made her breath catch. For a long moment, they stood frozen, caught in a moment of possibility. Then, from the house, they heard Samuel calling Victoria's name. The spell broken, they stepped apart, both slightly flushed. Victoria tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her heart racing. I should go see what Samuel needs, she said, her voice not quite steady. Mason nodded, clearing his throat. Of course. As Victoria hurried back to the house, she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her racing heart. For the first time since Frank's death, she felt truly alive, and the feeling was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The weeks leading up to the trial passed quickly. Victoria found herself settling more deeply into life at the ranch, learning its rhythms and routines. She insisted on taking over much of the cooking from Samuel, whose arthritis was particularly troublesome in the cooler autumn weather. The old man didn't object too strenuously, especially after tasting her apple pie. Mason spent long days working with the cattle, preparing for the approaching winter. Victoria often watched him from the porch or kitchen window, admiring his easy way with the animals and the men he occasionally hired to help with bigger tasks. At night, after Emma was asleep, the three adults would sit by the fire, talking or simply enjoying the comfortable silence. Victoria couldn't deny her growing feelings for Mason. Since their moment in the barn, something had shifted between them, a recognition of possibility, though neither spoke of it directly. Mason was unfailingly respectful, never presuming, yet Victoria caught him watching her sometimes with an intensity that made her skin warm. 3 days before they were due to leave for Deadwood and the trial, disaster struck. Victoria was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard shouts from outside. Through the window, she saw one of the ranch hands racing toward the house on horseback, his face pale with urgency. Mason met the man outside, and though Victoria couldn't hear their conversation, she saw Mason's expression change to one of alarm. He immediately began issuing orders, and men scrambled to obey. Samuel entered the kitchen, his face grave. Fire, he explained. Lightning strikes started ablaze in the north pasture. If they don't get it under control, we could lose half the herd. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. What can we do? Not much from here, Samuel admitted. Mason and the boys will handle it. They've fought fires before. But this fire was different. By nightfall, the sky to the north glowed an ominous orange, and Mason had not returned. Victoria paced the porch, Emma sleeping inside under Samuel's watchful eye. Just after midnight, horses approached, but only 3 riders returned from the group of 8 who had left. Victoria's heart nearly stopped until she recognized Mason's silhouette in the lead. His face was streaked with soot, his clothes singed in places, but he was alive. As he dismounted, Victoria rushed to him. Thank God, she breathed, resisting the urge to throw her arms around him. Is everyone all right? Mason's face was grim. No casualties, but Harris and Davis got burned pretty bad. They're at Doc Wilson's in town. He rubbed a hand over his face, leaving another streak of soot. We lost about 1/3 of the herd. Could have been worse. Victoria could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. Without thinking, she took his arm. "Come inside, you need to rest." To her surprise, Mason didn't argue. He allowed her to lead him into the house, where Samuel had hot coffee waiting. "Emma?" Mason asked, his voice rough from smoke. "Sleeping soundly," Victoria assured him. "She's fine." Mason nodded, seeming to relax slightly at this news. He accepted the coffee Samuel offered, then winced as the movement pulled at what appeared to be a burn on his forearm. "You're hurt," Victoria said, moving closer to examine the injury. "It's nothing," Mason insisted, but Victoria was already rolling up his sleeve to reveal an angry red burn about the size of her palm. "This needs to be treated," she said firmly. "Samuel, do we have any salve?" The old man nodded and disappeared into the back room, returning with a small jar. "Marigold and honey," he explained. "Old family recipe. Works better than anything the doctor has." Victoria cleaned the burn carefully with water, then applied the salve with gentle fingers. Mason watched her work, his eyes never leaving her face. "Thank you," he said softly when she finished. Victoria met his gaze. "You saved the ranch today." Mason shook his head slightly. "We saved what we could. I'm just glad everyone made it back alive." After Mason had eaten and cleaned up, Victoria expected him to retire to his room. Instead, he asked her to join him on the porch. Despite the late hour, she agreed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. They sat side by side in the darkness, the only light coming from the dying fire to the north and the countless stars overhead. Mason was quiet for so long that Victoria wondered if he'd fallen asleep. "I thought I might die out there today," he finally said, his voice low. "Fire's a funny thing, beautiful and deadly all at once." Victoria turned to look at him, his profile illuminated by starlight. "I was so afraid," she admitted, "when I saw only 3 riders returning." Mason reached for her hand in the darkness, his fingers warm against hers. "I kept thinking about you and Emma," he said, "about getting back to you." Victoria's breath caught at his words. "Mason." He turned to face her fully. "I know it hasn't been long since Frank. I know you're still grieving, but I need to tell you." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "These past weeks, having you and Emma here, it's like the ranch finally became a home. I never knew how empty it was until you filled it." Tears pricked Victoria's eyes at the simple honesty in his voice. "I feel the same," she whispered. "When I think about leaving, about taking Emma somewhere else, it feels wrong somehow." Hope flared in Mason's eyes. "Then don't leave," he said, his voice urgent. "Stay, not as my guest, but—" He took a deep breath. "Victoria, I'm falling in love with you. I know it's too soon to ask for more, but I want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. In that moment, she thought of Frank's smile in her dream, his blessing to find happiness again. She thought of Mason's kindness, his strength, the way he looked at Emma as if she were his own. Slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss. Mason remained perfectly still for a heartbeat, then his hand came up to cup her cheek as he returned the kiss with exquisite tenderness. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing unevenly. "I'm not ready for promises," Victoria said softly, "but I want to stay. I want to see where this leads." Mason pressed his forehead to hers. "That's all I ask," he murmured. "All the time you need." They sat together until the eastern sky began to lighten, talking quietly about everything and nothing, their hands entwined. As dawn broke, Victoria felt something new blossoming inside her, not replacing her love for Frank, but growing alongside it. A second chance she had never expected to find. The journey to Deadwood for the trial was tense but uneventful. Mason insisted on bringing Samuel along to help with Emma, leaving the ranch in the capable hands of his most trusted workers. They stayed at a respectable hotel, Mason and Samuel in one room, Victoria and Emma in another. The trial itself was mercifully brief. Victoria's testimony was clear and unwavering as she identified the 3 men who had attacked their wagon and killed Frank. When asked how she had survived afterward, she glanced at Mason, seated supportively in the gallery. "A good Samaritan found me and my daughter," she said simply. "He saved our lives." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding all 3 men guilty. The judge sentenced them to hang, and Victoria felt a complicated mix of emotions: relief, vindication, but no real joy. Frank was still gone, and nothing could bring him back. As they left the courthouse, Mason's hand on the small of her back, Victoria felt a chapter of her life closing. Justice had been done. Now she could truly begin to look forward. That evening, after Emma was asleep in their hotel room, Victoria joined Mason for a quiet dinner in the hotel restaurant. They spoke little during the meal, both processing the events of the day. It wasn't until they were walking back to their rooms that Mason broke the silence. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Victoria nodded, then reconsidered. "Not entirely," she admitted, "but I will be. It feels final now, like I can stop looking back and start looking ahead." Mason took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Whatever you need, however long it takes, I'm here." Victoria looked up at him, this man who had changed her life so completely in such a short time. "I don't think it will take much longer," she said softly. "Every day, I find myself thinking less about what I've lost and more about what I might gain." Mason's eyes darkened at her words. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Victoria," he murmured. "Sleep well." "Good night, Mason," she replied, reluctantly releasing his hand and entering her room. As she checked on Emma before preparing for bed, Victoria realized something profound. She was happy. Despite everything, despite the tragedy that had brought her here, she had found happiness again, and that felt like its own kind of miracle. The return journey to the ranch was easier, a sense of lightness pervading the group now that the trial was behind them. They arrived home on a crisp autumn afternoon, the ranch looking peaceful and welcoming under a clear blue sky. As Mason helped Victoria down from the wagon, Emma clutched securely in her other arm. Their eyes met and held. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that they were truly coming home together. That evening after dinner, Samuel mysteriously announced he was tired and retiring early, though it was barely past 7 o'clock. His knowing wink at Mason as he left the room made Victoria blush. Left alone by the fireplace, Victoria and Mason sat closer than usual, their shoulders touching. Emma lay on a blanket nearby, fascinated by her own fingers in the firelight. "I've been thinking," Mason said after a comfortable silence. "About the future." Victoria looked up at him, her heart quickening. "Oh," Mason turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Victoria, I meant what I said before. I'm falling in love with you. No, I've fallen in love with you. With both of you," he added, glancing at Emma. "I know it's only been a few months since Frank, and I understand if you need more time. But I want you to know that whenever you're ready, I want to make this official. I want to be a family." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy. "Mason O'Brien," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "are you asking me to marry you?" He smiled, reaching out to brush a tear from her cheek. "I suppose I am, though I'm making a mess of it." Victoria laughed softly. "No, you're not. You're doing it perfectly." She took a deep breath, her decision already made in her heart. "I don't need more time. I know what I want." Mason's eyes widened. "And what's that, you?" she said simply. "Us. A family. Yes, Mason. Yes, I'll marry you." Joy blazed across Mason's face as he pulled her into his arms, capturing her lips in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Victoria melted against him, her heart soaring with happiness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Mason pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you, Victoria Porter," he whispered. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you and Emma never go hungry or afraid again." Victoria smiled through her tears. "I love you too, Mason O'Brien. You saved us in more ways than you know." On the blanket, Emma chose that moment to let out a delighted gurgle, as if giving her own approval to the proceedings. Mason and Victoria laughed, their joy complete. The wedding took place on Christmas Eve, a simple ceremony in the town church attended by Samuel, the Jenkins from the general store, and a few other friends from town and neighboring ranches. Victoria wore a new dress of deep blue velvet, a gift from Mason, with a sprig of winter berries in her hair. Emma, now 7 months old and sitting up on her own, wore a matching blue dress and watched the proceedings with solemn eyes from Samuel's lap. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony, his young face beaming as he pronounced them husband and wife. When Mason kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the small gathering. "Mrs. O'Brien," Mason whispered against her lips, the name sending a thrill through Victoria. The reception was held at the ranch, the house decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. Samuel had outdone himself with the feast, and Mrs. Jenkins brought a magnificent wedding cake all the way from Deadwood. As the evening drew to a close and the guests departed, Mason and Victoria stood on the porch, his arm around her waist as they waved goodbye to the last wagon. Samuel had already retired, taking Emma with him to his small cabin behind the main house. His wedding gift to them, he'd said with a wink, was a night of privacy. When they were finally alone, Mason turned to his new wife, his eyes dark with promise. "Happy?" he asked. Victoria leaned up to kiss him softly. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," she answered truthfully. Mason swept her into his arms, making her gasp in surprise. "Then let me see if I can make you happier still, Mrs. O'Brien," he murmured, carrying her inside and kicking the door closed behind them. Later, much later, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Victoria rested her head on Mason's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder as he pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. Victoria smiled in the darkness. "I'm thinking about that day you found us, how close we came to never meeting at all." Mason's arms tightened around her. "I don't believe that," he said. "I think I was meant to find you and Emma. Some things are just meant to be." Victoria lifted her head to look at him, her heart full of love for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I think you're right," she whispered, leaning down to kiss him once more. Spring came to the Dakota Territory in a riot of wildflowers and new grass. The ranch prospered under Mason's careful management, the herd growing with the addition of healthy new calves. Emma, now nearly a year old, took her first tentative steps across the kitchen floor, falling into Mason's waiting arms with a delighted giggle. Victoria watched from the doorway, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach. She hadn't told Mason yet about the baby. She'd only confirmed her suspicions with a visit to Dr. Wilson the day before. Tonight, she decided. Tonight she would tell him. The opportunity came after dinner as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emma already asleep inside. Samuel had gone to town for supplies and wouldn't return until morning. "Mason," Victoria began, her voice slightly nervous, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, his expression curious. "What is it, love?" Victoria took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly, "in about 7 months." Mason's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "A baby," he whispered, his eyes wide. "We're having a baby," Victoria nodded, tears of joy springing to her eyes at his reaction. "Are you happy?" In answer, Mason pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Victoria, you've given me everything I never knew I wanted: a family, a purpose, a love I never thought I'd find." Victoria held him tightly, marveling at how far they'd come in less than a year. From the depths of despair to the heights of joy, from strangers to family. "I love you, Mason O'Brien," she whispered. "Thank you for saying not while I'm here that day. Thank you for saving us." Mason pulled back to look into her eyes, his own shining with unshed tears of happiness. "No, Victoria," he said softly. "You saved me." As the last light faded from the sky, they sat wrapped in each other's arms, watching the first stars appear. Inside, Emma slept peacefully, and within Victoria, their second child grew stronger each day. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. From tragedy had come joy. From hunger had come fulfillment. From 2 broken paths had come one shared journey. And in the vast expanse of the Dakota Territory, under endless skies, the O'Brien family had found their home and each other. 6 years later, the sound of children's laughter filled the yard of the O'Brien ranch as 5-year-old Frank chased his older sister Emma around the corral. Victoria smiled from the porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their third child grew steadily larger. She was due in less than a month, and Mason had been hovering like a mother hen, insisting she rest more than she felt necessary. "Mama, look." Emma called, her dark hair streaming behind her as she climbed expertly onto the lower rail of the corral fence. At 7 years old, she was the spitting image of Victoria, but with an adventurous streak that was all Mason. "Be careful, sweetheart," Victoria called back, though she knew Emma was as comfortable around horses as most children were around house cats. Mason had taught her to ride almost before she could walk, and the girl had a natural gift with animals. Frank, named for the father he would never know but whose memory was honored in the O'Brien household, was more cautious than his sister, but just as determined. His reddish-brown hair caught the sunlight as he clambered up beside Emma, his freckled face screwed up in concentration. The sound of hoofbeats drew Victoria's attention to the path leading from town. Mason appeared on his chestnut stallion, returning from his monthly trip to Deadwood for supplies and mail. Behind him rode Samuel on his gentle mare, the old man still spry despite his 70 years. Papa's back. Emma shouted, jumping down from the fence and racing toward the approaching riders, Frank following close behind. Mason dismounted in one fluid motion and scooped both children into his arms, spinning them around as they shrieked with delight. Victoria's heart swelled at the sight of them, her husband still as handsome as the day she'd met him, though now with a few strands of silver at his temples. Setting the children down, Mason strode toward the porch, his face lighting up at the sight of Victoria. After 6 years of marriage, he still looked at her as if she were the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "How are my girls?" he asked, climbing the steps to kiss her softly before kneeling to press a gentle kiss to her belly. "Both of you," Victoria smiled, running her fingers through his hair. "We're fine. Your son has been kicking up a storm today." Mason grinned up at her. "Son, is it? You sound mighty sure." "Mother's intuition," Victoria replied with a smile. They'd played this game with each pregnancy, Mason insisting they were having a girl, Victoria certain it was a boy. So far they were tied. Samuel approached the porch, a bundle of letters in his hand. "Mail came," he announced, handing the stack to Victoria, "including one from that fancy school back east that's been corresponding with Emma." Victoria raised an eyebrow as she sorted through the letters. Sure enough, there was one addressed to Miss Emma Porter O'Brien with the letterhead of the Brenfield Academy for Young Ladies in Boston. "What do they want with our Emma?" Mason asked, rising to his feet. Victoria broke the seal and scanned the contents, her eyes widening. "It's from the headmistress. She says she received Emma's drawings that Dr. Wilson sent them and, Mason, they're offering her a scholarship. They want her to come study art with them when she's 12. Mason's expression was a complex mixture of pride and concern. "Boston." "That's clear across the country." Emma and Frank had joined them on the porch, the little girl's eyes bright with curiosity. "What's Boston, Papa?" Mason lifted her into his arms. "It's a big city far away, Pumpkin, a place where very smart people go to learn things." "Like me?" Emma asked. Victoria and Mason exchanged glances over her head. "Exactly like you," Victoria said softly. "But that's still years away. We'll talk about it when the time comes." As Samuel led the children inside to wash up for dinner, Mason pulled Victoria into his arms, mindful of her belly between them. "Our daughter, the artist," he murmured. "Can't say I'm surprised. She's got your talent." Victoria leaned into his embrace. "And your determination, if she wants to go when the time comes. Then we'll find a way to make it happen," Mason finished for her, "but I'll miss her something fierce." Victoria smiled up at him. "We still have years before we have to worry about that, and who knows? By then, we might have a whole brood of O'Briens running around this ranch." Mason laughed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I like the sound of that, Mrs. O'Brien." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, and Samuel had retired to his cabin, Victoria and Mason sat on the porch swing, her head resting on his shoulder as they gazed at the stars. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle and the soft chirp of crickets. "Do you ever think about that day?" Victoria asked softly. "The day we met," Mason's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Often," he admitted. "Especially when I watch you with the children, I remember how fierce you looked, ready to fight me off with your last breath to protect Emma." Victoria smiled at the memory. "I was so afraid and so hungry." "Your baby was left hungry," Mason murmured, echoing his words from that fateful day, "and I said not while I'm here." And you've kept that promise, Victoria said, lifting her face to his. None of us has ever gone hungry again for food, for love, for anything that matters. Mason kissed her then, a slow, tender kiss that still held all the passion of their first. When they parted, he rested his hand on her belly, smiling as he felt a strong kick against his palm. I think you're right, he said. Definitely a boy, Victoria laughed. I told you, mother's intuition. As they sat together under the endless Dakota sky, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate day when she'd thought all was lost, to this moment of complete fulfillment, a loving husband, beautiful children, a home filled with joy. Frank's death would always be a tragedy, a life cut short by senseless violence. But from that tragedy had come this a second chance, a new family, a love that had healed wounds she'd thought would never mend. I love you, Mason O'Brien, she whispered. More than I can ever say. Mason's eyes, still as blue and clear as the day they'd met, held hers with tender devotion. And I love you, Victoria O'Brien. You and our children are the greatest blessing of my life. As the baby kicked again beneath their joined hands, Victoria felt a profound sense of peace. Life had taken her on an unexpected path, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be here, on this ranch, in this man's arms, surrounded by the family they had built together. Their story, which had begun with hunger and desperation, had transformed into one of abundance and joy. And as stars wheeled overhead and their unborn child moved between them, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters were yet to be written.